Hello everyone, and welcome to Meanwhile in the West, my weekly series where I go through the letters to the editor in my local newspaper, the West Australian, and I criticise the idiots who've written in stupid things. First letter. New location, 27th June 2014. With reference to the missing Malaysia Airlines flight MH370, it is clear the experts are being baffled by their own science. MH370 search shifts south 20th of the 6th. All the evidence points to a catastrophic failure of the aircraft between its last reported position and its failure to report its next position. When, and if, it is found, it will be in the Gulf of Thailand. Cameron Bell, South Perth. I like these letters. I like the uninformed, optimistic, armchair expert writing in kind of letters. The experts are not baffled by their own science, as you would have it. It's just simply that the data is not that good, and all of the best analysis that we can do doesn't allow us to narrow down the location of this of the plane to a sufficiently small size that it can easily be found. Given the depth of the water, even if we knew pretty much exactly where it was going to be, it would still be a monumental task to find the wreckage of this plane, which everybody has basically agreed has crashed into the water somewhere, and I think there is even some kind of agreement on pretty much where. And the idea that you, as an armchair expert, reading, I assume, the newspaper, which doesn't really give much detail at all, and the occasional pretty map, you're in a far better place to analyse where this plane is compared to the experts, which, the international experts have been brought in by numerous different countries to analyse the data. It's just laughable. And the fact that you feel so secure in your knowledge and that you feel compelled to write into the newspaper and share it with the rest of us. That's one thing I like about letters to the editor, is it brings out people like you. Next letter. It means more jobs, 28th of June 2014. What's wrong with 24-hour shopping? If business people are happy to open these hours, then bring it on. The unions will bitch. Even if the workers were paid $5,000 a day, there would be no pleasing them, so take no notice. As 24-hour shopping means 3 shifts worked in an 8-hour day, that also means many more jobs. Isn't this what Australia needs? Ian M. McPherson, Albany. Now, I've heard this argument before, and I hear it every time when I talk about liberalising the regulations on shopping hours. So here in Western Australia, we have relatively regulated shopping hours compared to a lot of the rest of the world and the rest of the country. It's only recently that we've moved to having late night trading for, say, supermarkets. We had a limited deregulation where small sized, so under a certain number of employees, you could open essentially whatever hours you wanted, but anything larger than a certain amount, which basically covered most supermarkets, you were restricted to essentially trading 9 to 5, 6 days a week, Monday through Saturday. We've had a bit of deregulation of that now. We have late night trading for all supermarkets, so up to, I think, about 9 o'clock at night, and we have Sunday trading 11 till 5, and there's been talk about basically deregulating entirely to allow for 24-hour shopping centres to be open whenever they want. So the argument is that, and there is plans actually to build, because there's a patchwork of regulations, there is a small country shire that is outside of a fairly major city, well, major by Western Australian standards, which, due to some strange anomaly in its laws, means that they can open 24 hours. So there's plans to build a 24-hour supermarket or department store there. And always when they talk about this, the suggestion is that somehow this will create jobs because they will need to staff these supermarkets. My understanding is essentially the number of jobs are going to be relatively small. Most 24-hour supermarkets would have not even a handful of staff on over the graveyard shift, because they would simply have very little trade, as they would have the bare minimum number of staff to just keep the store open. So that the actual number of jobs would probably be relatively small. But the other important thing is that essentially for a given population, say the 2 million odd people in Western Australia, we're essentially going to be buying more or less the same number of groceries, regardless of how how long the shops are open or shut for. Simply deregulating trading hours is unlikely to lead to a significant increase in the amount of groceries that people are going to want to buy. And so this fundamental problem to me suggests that there's not going to be huge amounts of money flowing for the purchasing of groceries, and yet there's going to be an increase in the number of jobs. So somehow these are going to need to be paid for. The only way I can see this being paid for is either the supermarkets are going to take a loss, which is not long-term sustainable, i.e. they're going to become less productive as a result, or they're going to have to increase their prices. Now, people would say, well, as long as there's competition, they won't be able to increase their prices. But I suspect that part of this is the idea to drive out the small competitors. That's why we had the limited deregulation we had, was the idea that small businesses need to have some competitive advantage over the large supermarkets, because the large supermarket chains can do all sorts of anti-competitive behaviour, or grey, not quite anti-competitive according to the law, but still anti-competitive behaviour, to drive out smaller businesses and therefore reduce competition, and which then will eventually lead to increased prices that we're all paying. So I'm not quite sure. I don't quite understand the simplistic idea that simply there will have to be more jobs, but that nobody would have to pay for that, to me doesn't make any sense. Somewhere along the line, somebody's going to have to pay for those extra jobs. It's not going to make us more productive to have shopping centres open for longer. In fact, having supermarkets open for less hours would actually be more productive, because we would be purchasing basically the same number of groceries in less time, which means that the productivity of the shops would actually be higher. So we're not all suddenly going to get increases in productivity. We're not going to be buying significantly more groceries as a result. And therefore, I think the best argument they've got is somehow we as a country will become more affluent, because there'll be more work, so people will get paid more, therefore they'll be spending more, and so they'll simply purchase more expensive groceries, which will somehow offset the cost of running a supermarket. I don't know. And on a little side note, this idea that the unions are always against, are always anti all of this stuff is not actually true. We've actually recently had it's generally unions advocate for pay rises, because that's sort of a big part of their role that they play. But recently we've had a union that was advocating for pay decreases. A whole bunch of workers were advocating that they wanted to actually decrease their pay so that the company they're working for could stay afloat, and they could all keep their jobs. So it's not a truism that unions always advocate for pay rises. So there. Next letter. Told you so, 30th of June 2014. When boatloads of Middle Eastern men were sailing to Australia, I warned against accepting men from a culture that changed countries, not beliefs. Was I right now that some of them are back fighting and killing their own? Gwen Moppet, Doubleview. Yes, so I presume you were advocating. I assume that what you're referencing here is the conflict in and around Syria, and the reports that we've had nominally, I think Australian citizens, or at least Australian residents who have some kind of cultural tie, or perhaps were born in Syria, who have been travelling back there to fight on one or other, on one of the sides in the conflict at least. And there's been condemnation of that and outrage here in Australia that, Australians or people who, live here would want to travel overseas to fight in some kind of conflict. First of all, the parallel, it seems to me, is back to World War I in particular, where Australia entered World War I simply because Britain did. And we all went to fight on the British side of the battle, because that's where, a lot of Australians were born, and that's who our government had allegiance to. There's not a huge difference, other than the fact that the Australian culture at the time was majority British, and the government had official ties to Britain, and therefore it had an air of legitimacy that, these minority of Middle Eastern people don't quite have the same air of legitimacy. But basically it's the same idea, that then Australia had very close ties to Britain culturally, and we naturally assumed that we would fight in whatever war the British got into. World War I basically didn't influence Australia at all, and we could quite easily have stayed out of it if we didn't have that strong cultural and legal attachment. And the second thing is that we are talking, when you say boatloads, I mean, you are literally correct that they are boatloads, but you are not correct in the implication that it is a large numbers of people. It's a relatively small number of people. I think it's 100 odd people, maybe 150, I think is the number I heard, of the entire Australian population have travelled back to Syria. Most of these people are recent migrants. I very much doubt that second or third generation migrants to Australia would be travelling to Syria to fight, or that there would be many of these, or it would be a significant problem. And in fact, yes, simply transporting somebody to Australia and then becoming an Australian resident or citizen does not change their culture. But certainly, we have done an incredibly good job as a nation of assimilating people across the generations. I mean, their children and their children's children will be assimilated just as well as any other thing. And so to deny an entire group of people, Middle Eastern men, on the basis of the behaviour of some small percentage of them, on the idea that somehow their culture is impervious to assimilation into a broader Australian culture, in the face of all the evidence against that, all the evidence that shows that actually that's not what's happened, just smacks of racism, or at worst, and being ill-informed and easily inflamed by the articles in this paper. Next letter, dastardly plot, 30th of June 2014. What better way to sabotage the public train transport system by not providing nearly enough car park bays at the stations? Brad Capes Kublab. Yeah, nobody's actually trying to sabotage the public train transport system. In fact, the government is investing in it largely, a government of both stripes, because it is a winner. It is absolutely so much cheaper to run than the kind of road infrastructure. And now that they're charging for parking, there's actually huge incentive to provide more car park bays. The fact that they haven't is not because they were trying to sabotage the system, it's just down to poor planning, perhaps, or incompetence at worst. And that's if there even is an issue. So at this point, I suspect that now that they're going to charge for parking, there will be incentive for them to build more car park bays in those stations that don't have enough, so that they can actually make good money off it. This reminds me of Hanlon's razor. Hanlon's razor is simply never attribute to malice that which is better explained through incompetence. Appeasement fails, 1st of July 2014. This young man, Junaid Thorne, was born here in Perth, so where on earth was he radicalised? Why? It all started at home, of course. His passport ought to be revoked, and he should be sent to live with the people he loves. We should stop trying to appease radical people, which was tried with Hitler. How did that go? Wake up to the truth, Australia. Hug it, Yanchuk. Oh, so there were many, many letters in this vein. This one I particularly liked because they managed to get Hitler in there. So the backstory is there's a guy called Junaid Thorne. He was born in Perth. He is an Australian of Middle Eastern descent, I think. And essentially he sprang to some prominence over the last week because the newspaper ran a series of articles publicising his radical militant Islamic videos and preaching, as it were. And so the suggestion that a lot of people said is that basically if he likes, if he likes jihad or Islamic theocracy so much that we should just kick him out of Australia and, send him to live in some Muslim country. And of course, the problem with that is that one, it's totally illegal, and secondly, it's completely unethical. This man is Australian. You can talk all you like about his cultural background, but that is no more relevant than my cultural background as an English person, or somebody else's cultural background as a Italian, or a Greek person, or a Chinese person. If you're an Australian, you're an Australian. If you're a citizen, you're a citizen, and you are not subject to deportation. In fact, what it means is that you not only have the right to be here, but you have the right to freely express your views on any topic, no matter how disliked that is by the majority, as long as you are not breaking any laws. Now, I'm not sure, I suspect that this person hasn't broken any laws yet, or if he has, he will soon be charged with breaking laws. And essentially, the law says that you can pretty much say a whole pile of hateful things, as long as you're not advocating specific violence against specific groups of people. Some of the stuff he said about Jewish people in particular probably will fall foul of some of the racial discrimination laws, and I think they might be able to charge him on that. But short of that, he hasn't actually done anything illegal. Now, I don't agree with any of what he said at all. I think it's quite despicable. But the solution to a lot of this that we've found over the years, and the difference particularly with somebody like Hitler, is that the solution to people who are saying hateful things is to have an open and tolerant society that tolerates them saying those things, but does not accept any of what they've said. Now, this is not appeasement. This person is not arguing for freedom of speech. If he was arguing for freedom of speech and we gave him freedom of speech, you could say that that was appeasement. That is giving him what he wants. And that was certainly how it was characterised with Hitler. Hitler was conquering countries, and the idea of appeasement was essentially to let him get away with some amount of that. Now, whether or not that's historically accurate, I'm not sure, but that is the sort of central idea of appeasement as applied to Hitler. Now, this person is not saying any of that. This person is saying that what he wants is an Islamic theocracy that covers the entire world, where everybody is forced to convert to Islam, and everybody is forced to live under Sharia law. Now, nobody at all, left, right, whatever, nobody in the Australian public, apart from a tiny percentage who agree with him, is willing to appease him on that. All we're saying is that he should have the same right to voice his hateful opinions as anybody else who's voicing hateful opinions. And he should be subject to the same laws as anybody else, any other Australian. So we don't deport Australian people for having hateful views. Australian people who commit crime are punished for that in our court system, and Australian people who haven't committed crimes are allowed to live within our community. That is the essential thing. And so there is no appeasement here. There is no connection with Hitler. And somebody else suggested, or also another letter drew this line between him and Hitler, saying, but wasn't Hitler just some charismatic extremist? And nobody paid any attention to him, and look what happened. He rose to power and then caused World War II. The big difference here is that Hitler wasn't getting the same coverage that this guy is getting, the same negative coverage when he was a young, relatively charismatic extremist preacher, if he ever was one like that. What we have discovered is that actually bringing these people to light, bringing their views to light, showing them for what they are, and essentially contrasting them with the views of our society, which is exactly what's been happening in this case, is an effective way of countering it. Yes, you will never stop people from being radicalized. There's no absolute stopping to that, but certainly up until the point where people are committing crimes, the best approach is simply to bring it to light that there are people in our community saying these kind of things, that they're hateful, they're bigoted, that we disagree with them, and that nobody should be encouraged to join their movement. And that's exactly what's happening in the paper. Lastly for today, Diet and Thrift, 1st of July 2014. Mark Garretson, Good Food for All, that is 21st of the 6th, suggests the government should devise policies to make healthy food more affordable. Why? All that is needed is a little common sense, budgeting, thinking ahead, buying food when it's at its cheapest. Lena McKenna, North Beach. So Lena, you're missing the point here. So essentially there are two arguments at people level, and it's hard to mesh them together. So there's the argument at an individual level. So let's say we have a single person comes to you and says, what should I spend how can I afford to eat healthily? Then yes, Lena, your suggestions, that a little bit of common sense, budgeting, blah, 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 this person should be able to buy healthy food, even if it does cost them a little bit more. As long as they plan, they should be able to afford it within their budget. Now, what Mark Garretson is saying, and actually which is more the government's responsibility, is as society as a whole. So a society as a whole, doing that individual level of counselling, encouraging people to think ahead and budget and stuff, is relatively ineffective compared to the effect of changing prices. That is, government regulation is quite a straightforward and reasonable way of artificially shifting prices. So making unhealthy, so you could quite relatively easily, you could put, say, a sugar tax or a fat tax on food, which would make relatively unhealthy food more expensive than the healthier food. And we know that overwhelmingly prices of food has a big impact on what people buy. And so if you want to have a biggest bang for your buck, yes, the government should devise policies to make healthy food more affordable. This is the best way that we know of to get more people eating more healthily. And the idea of putting it on a personal onus, while morally you may have a point there that it is up to each individual person to make a choice, we know that that is not a particularly successful way. A good comparison is with cigarette smoking. So we have had drastic reductions in the amount of people, in the rates of smoking in many countries, Australia in particular. And the government has tied a number of approaches to that. Overwhelmingly, increasing the prices of cigarettes through taxation has a much more dramatic effect on the number of people smoking than does all the education campaigns. So you need the education campaigns. They are effective, they work, they're good. Sometimes they're even, they're reasonable value for money. But overwhelmingly, if you want to get less people smoking, simply putting up the prices is far more effective. Anyway, that's it for this week. It's good to try and talk some sense into some people once in a while. I feel better after that. Join me next week when we find out what's happening in the West. See you later.